Time was when Cincinnati needed but 25 policemen to guard its moral safety. That was in the 1850s, not far from 1880. But now, with little increase in territory, a police force of 300 men and 5 patrol wagons, each the equivalent of 20 additional officers. Its streets reek with crime. Not a thoroughfare in its limits, but has been stained with human blood. In the decade yet to close, over 800 arrests have been made of men who, with knives, pistols, or other deadly weapons, have, with more or less success, attempted the lives of fellow creatures. And how has this wholesale onslaught on society been met? In what way has the biblical injunction of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth been followed? The reply can be given in as many words as may be counted on one hand. 4 men have been hanged, or 1 in 50. Laxity of laws give the Queen City of the West its crimson record. Preeminence in art, science, and industry avail nothing where murder is rampant and the lives of citizens are unsafe, even in broad daylight. That's an excerpt from a March 4, 1884 article in the Cincinnati Enquirer entitled "College of Murder, an Unusually Successful and Prosperous Season." For its literary melodrama, its shameless fear-mongering, and the events that it would help produce, College of Murder arguably remains the most irresponsible, notorious article ever released by a newspaper that has remained in print since 1841. In addition to hyperbolic prose, the article aggregates 6 years of offenses to produce crime statistics that are intended to shock readers, including 553 attempted murders, 948 arrests for carrying concealed weapons, and 92 successful acts of homicide, ranging from first-degree murder to manslaughter. But in reality, when broken down annually over the previous couple of decades, there was no crime wave. By the end of 1883, serious crimes were actually down, with the exception of murder. And even those numbers looked like an anomaly rather than a pattern. In 1883, 23 people were arrested for murder and 4 for manslaughter. That was up, but homicides peaked and receded in the past. In 1867, 20 people were charged with murder and 1 with manslaughter. There was a total of 26 homicide arrests in 1874. Then numbers declined before they jumped to 23 in 1881. And arrests were an imperfect statistic. No one was arrested in 3 killings in 1882 because they were murder-suicides. And there were no arrests in 3 more killings in 1882 because the crimes remained unsolved. In fact, some of the increases in murder arrests were attributable to better law enforcement. The Cincinnati Police Department still had a lot of faults, but Mayor Stevens and Police Chief Riley were breaking with the past and trying to hire, promote, and fire police officers on merit, rather than treating the jobs as political spoils, as they always had been before. Unlike previous years, 100% of Cincinnati homicide cases were solved in 1883. Any modern police department would, pun intended, kill for those stats. More murder prosecutions were also partly the result of how people were being charged. As part of his law and order campaign promises, Prosecutor Pugh was charging people with murder who would have been charged with manslaughter in previous administrations. So an increase in murder prosecutions corresponded with a slight decline in manslaughter prosecutions, meaning there weren't necessarily more homicides, they were just being charged more harshly. So, sorry to repeat myself, but there was no crime wave. However, the grisly nature of several recent crimes and a few cases that made the judicial process look almost comically broken made it easy to convince readers that the wheels were coming off and that the general public was in danger as a result. For example, on July 23, 1881, William McHugh stabbed his wife Sophia to death in the 6th Street Market in front of hundreds of witnesses. Following 3 convictions in 3 trials for the same thing, McHugh was still in jail in 1884, awaiting a May execution date, and he was hoping for a pardon. On October 29, 1882, Emil Trumpeter stabbed his neighbor to death over the noise of persistent screaming matches with his wife. He was tried twice and convicted twice, then forfeited his 3rd trial when even he got so frustrated with the lawyers that he just pled guilty. So Trumpeter was in jail awaiting sentencing in 1884. On December 24, 1883, Joe Palmer and Bill Berner murdered William Kirk. Although the crime had been covered recently and extensively, the Cincinnati Enquirer rehashed the gory details in the College of Murder article, said that both of the boy murderers had confessed, adding that Berner had, quote, fully corroborated, unquote, Palmer's version of events. This wasn't true, and there was no mention of the discrepancies in their stories, nor that Berner had recanted critical parts of his confession. On January 31, 1884, Patrick Hartnett, who was clearly severely mentally ill and suffering from delusions, chopped his wife to death with an axe as his terrified children watched. This crime was also recalled in its truly, absolutely horrific details. Then, on February 15th, 1884, Alan Ingalls and Ben Johnson bludgeoned all 3 members of the Taylor family to death to sell their bodies to the Ohio Medical College. So these last 3 crimes in particular, all occurring between Christmas Eve 1883 and mid-February 1884, they were all astoundingly shocking crimes. And the Cincinnati Enquirer was definitely using them to stir the pot, to rile up the public. But the Enquirer wasn't alone. All the major papers were competing for sales by going tit for tat in their fear-mongering and condemnation of the justice system. The Commercial Gazette claimed that both murder and rape were increasing dramatically, even though this was objectively untrue. And the paper said it knew where to lay the blame and what to do about it. The Commercial said that the moral depravity of defense attorneys, who they referred to derisively as criminal lawyers, were to blame for corrupting the court system. T.C. Campbell wasn't specified, but he didn't have to be when the paper rehashed William Kirk's murder. The Commercial Gazette also reserved some of its blame for a jury selection process that ensured that, in their words, only the most ignorant part of the community served on juries. So, no wonder Berner and Palmer killed Kirk. The Commercial Gazette wasn't surprised, because this combination of corrupt lawyers, dumb jurors, and lenient sentences had made human life cheap in Cincinnati. Now, this was a shameful excuse for journalism. There were problems with the justice system, but it appears to have worked at least as well then as it does today. And the crime wave that was supposed to strike fear in the hearts of every decent, law-abiding Cincinnatian was an invention of the media. Nevertheless, the Commercial Gazette spelled out the options as stark choices, writing that, quote, "The only real administration of justice in atrocious crimes is by Judge Lynch," unquote. In this environment, with all of these presumptions of guilt of the accused and calls for more hangings, judicial or otherwise, with the Inquirer claiming that the city had lapsed into an orgy of bloodletting, and the Commercial telling the public that the defense attorneys are themselves criminals, and that the juries are too dumb to be trusted, 17-year-old William Berner goes to trial for murder. I'm Mike Morgan, a writer, attorney, historian, and Amy, like Tom Waits, I don't lose my composure in a high-speed chase.
I'm well aware of that. I'm Amy Morgan. I'm also an attorney. I enjoy history, but I'm actually more of a true crime and political junkie. I'm helping tell this story because it really involves all three of those things.
And this is Truth Deferred, Season 1, The National Guard Massacre. A true story about biased media, corruption, murder, a slaughter of unarmed civilians by National Guard troops, and the cover-up that followed. A cover-up which hid the truth so well that this is the first time it's being told.
Every week in the intro to this show, we say that the truth of this story has been hidden. That doesn't mean that no one has ever heard about the courthouse riot. It means that important truths were replaced with disinformation, and that false rumors and outright lies were repeated so many times that they became accepted fact. We're going to get into some important examples in this episode, starting with this. There was a trashy book called The Cincinnati Riot, Its Causes and Results, written in 1886 that claimed to be the definitive history of these events. In reality, it was one of the most important early sources of disinformation. For example, the book says that through T.C. Campbell's treacherous, dishonest, unethical legal tactics, he, quote, succeeded in separating the indictments, unquote, because he knew, quote, that the populace would be, as usual, content to let a white man escape, since the Negro Palmer was certain to be hanged, unquote. Now, there are several major problems with these statements. First, Ohio law prohibited joint trials. The Ohio Revised Code required murder defendants to be tried separately. Campbell was a great lawyer, but if Berner had been represented by a fence post, they still would have been tried separately. And Berner was obviously going to be tried first because the presiding judge, Judge Matthews, was under massive public pressure to try them as early as possible. And Berner had lawyers ready to go to trial, while the court was still searching for somebody willing to represent Palmer. The court tried to appoint former prosecutors Miller Outcalt and William Howard Taft to defend Palmer, but they both refused.
As a random aside, although it may explain a few things about some of his behavior, Common Pleas Court Judge Matthews was the younger and significantly less accomplished brother of Stanley Matthews, who President Garfield appointed to the United States Supreme Court. Our Judge Matthews was new to the bench, and he was not one of the judges that people accused of being in T.C. Campbell's pocket. I mean, I think the bigger problem with the part of that book that you just quoted is the simplified racial narrative of it. Yes, there was systemic racial disparities in the justice system. News alert, there still are. But Cincinnati wasn't Mississippi. Race probably played some role in how people perceived Berner versus Palmer. But these two young men appeared to be very different people in ways that had nothing to do with race. And there were important differences in their cases.
Before trial, T.C. Campbell offered Prosecutor Pugh a plea deal for second-degree murder. Now, this would have meant life in prison without the possibility of parole. Pugh rejected it out of hand. He refused to take any outcome less than hanging a 17-year-old, which is another commonly lost piece of this story.
Jury selection began in late February 1884. Jury selection was arduous. Then, as now, prospective jurors could be struck for either cause or by peremptory challenge. Using a peremptory challenge means that whoever is using it, and both the prosecution and the defense get them, can eliminate a prospective juror without a stated reason. Today, in Ohio, both the prosecution and the defense get 12 peremptory challenges in a capital murder case. In 1884, both sides got 2 in all types of cases except capital murder cases. As a safeguard against executing innocent people, the prosecution only got 2 peremptory challenges, just like any other type of trial, but the defense got 23 of them. A lot of people thought that was excessive, but it was the law.
Both sides could also challenge prospective jurors for cause. Generally speaking, that worked the same as it does today. You couldn't serve as a juror if you were on the grand jury, or if you were going to be a witness in the case, or if you were related to the defendant or one of the attorneys. In 1884, you couldn't serve if you were, quote, an habitual drunkard, unquote. You also needed to be fluent in English, which was a common problem in Cincinnati because a lot of the population was only fluent in German at the time. But the fuzziest reason to strike a juror for cause was that he had formed an opinion as to the innocence or guilt of the accused prior to being called, and the prospective juror said that he would be unlikely to change his mind regardless of what he heard during the trial. The prosecution could also strike jurors for cause in a first-degree murder because the person was opposed to capital punishment. Capital punishment was statistically more popular then than it is today, but it still had opposition. One of the prospective jurors in the Berner trial was eliminated by Prosecutor Pugh because he said that he was in favor of capital punishment as a concept, but he would have difficulty imposing it on Berner due to his age. By the time a jury was seated, 262 prospective jurors had been called to find 12 reasonably unbiased men. The press made a big deal out of this, portraying it as part of a broken justice system. But the crime was national news, and all of the local papers wrote about Berner and Palmer with descriptors like the boy murderers or the red-handed fiends. The press had already declared them unequivocally guilty, so there was nothing sinister in excusing so many prospective jurors for having strong opinions about Berner's guilt.
Even before a full jury is seated, the press starts attacking, insulting, and discrediting jurors. When juror Francis Buck tells the court that he's unfamiliar with the case because he only reads the market reports in the paper, the Cincinnati Enquirer categorizes his addition to the jury as making 1 saloon keeper, 3 farmers, and 1 ignoramus. Without expressing it in an overtly disparaging way, the paper notes that a disproportionate amount of the jury pool comes from rural townships, and that 4 of the 12 jurors are farmers. They also make the unsubstantiated claim that juror Charles C. Dallahan, a printer from the Harrison News, quote, seemed to be under the influence of liquor, unquote, when he is seated on the jury. Some reporters almost seem to be hedging their bets on the outcome, laying the groundwork for blaming a stupid jury if the verdict was less than hanging. They may have just been desperate for something to print because jury selection was so tedious and took so long, and they needed something to write. But once this practice of insulting the jury started, it remained a thing throughout the trial. When the trial started in earnest, opening statements didn't provide much drama either. Assistant Prosecutor Jordan Thomas delivered the opening argument for the state. It was a solid outline of the crime and what they intended to prove, but it didn't contain any new evidence, no bombshell news. T.C. Campbell was lead defense counsel, but he was in another courtroom on a previously scheduled case. So the defense's opening was given by Moses Wilson. He was a former judge and one of Berner's legal dream team. Wilson was capable of impressive eloquence, but he preferred to hold the defense strategy close to his chest here. He rose and simply said that Berner was, quote, not guilty of murder in the first degree as charged in the indictment, unquote. And then he sat back down. It was such an unexpected and unorthodox opening that Prosecutor Pugh objected, saying he was entitled to more of an explanation of the defense. That, in fact, was not his legal right, and the objection was overruled.
The murder of William Kirk was a tragedy with ripple effects that deepened the pathos. Between Berner's arrest and the trial, the widowed Minnie Kirk was so overcome with shock and grief that she had to be hospitalized, forcing her to miss her husband's funeral. Destitute without him, she took a job as a servant with a family in Walnut Hills. It appears to have been a live-in position that forced her to entrust her infant son to the care of family members. While out of her arms, her infant son David developed a lung ailment and died at just slightly over 2 years old. The widow Minnie Kirk was the first witness called. Dressed in deep mourning black, she appeared frail, sick, and spoke with a soft, trembling voice about the last time she saw her husband. Minnie, the wrongly accused John Neal, Kirk's former business partner Henry Strauss, and Star Livery proprietor Charles Heyman all helped the state lay the foundation of their case.
But the most damning witnesses were the people who saw Berner and Palmer after they dumped Kirk's body. Before returning the wagon, they stopped into a West End saloon. Customers and the bartender described an upbeat, carefree young man. Berner borrowed a mop and a bucket from the bartender, and they used it to clean out the bed of the wagon, although they obviously left traces of blood and hair. Then, ironically, they adopted Bill Kirk's bad habit of flashing money around, which was especially ironic since it was Kirk's own money. Berner's girlfriend, Matilda Bauman, who went by Tilly, she lived with her mother near the saloon. So Berner and Palmer had been there before. They were known there. They were typically broke and frugal. Now, without any explanation, they have these rolls of money. They left the saloon to take the wagon back to Heyman's after a couple of drinks. They got the wagon back around 8 o'clock rather than the expected 10 o'clock, so they unsuccessfully tried to argue for a partial refund of the rental fee, which drew more attention to them and the time frame of when they had the wagon. They were really kind of helping cement some evidence. Berner and Palmer then went their separate ways for the evening, but their behavior over the next couple of days looked very similar. They both spent freely over Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. Berner returned to the saloon by his girlfriend's apartment. He bought rounds and he offered to loan an acquaintance, actually a guy that he didn't know very well. He offered to loan him $50, which is the modern equivalent of somewhere over $1,500 today. He hung out with Tilly until around midnight. Then he went bar hopping with a guy from the bar. The next day was Christmas. He gave Tilly some jewelry, and he bought her mother a barrel of potatoes. He, Tilly, her mother, her aunt, and one of Berner's friends then went to various Christmas balls and celebrations and over the Rhine, with Berner generously paying for everything. He also told people that he was a horse trader, clearly trying to sell Kirk's horses.
You can't deny that a barrel of potatoes is one of the best Christmas gifts ever. But the rest of his behavior is very damning. This just isn't what remorse looks like. This isn't a guy acting like he was forced to participate in a murder, then was overcome with guilt and grief. I suppose you could argue he was trying to live a role to convince himself that he was a badass desperado that he wasn't, but this is very cold-blooded behavior. Legally, his case also seems hopeless. There's no way to claim either self-defense or insanity. He was undeniably present for the murder, played a willing role in disposing of the body, and took about half the money. You can't argue that they have the wrong guy. You can't argue that Kirk accidentally fell into a hammer multiple times. Initially, Berner consistently stuck to the story that he didn't know Palmer was really going to kill Kirk until he was in the process of it. If that were true, he wouldn't be innocent, but he would have lacked the premeditation the prosecutor would need to establish first-degree capital murder. But he eventually changed his story and confessed to telling Palmer in advance that if he struck the first blow, he would join in.
He did confess to premeditated murder, but what he said and when he said it is the one weakness in the state's case, and not just technically or strategically. T.C. Campbell latches onto some key problems with Berner's most damning version of a confession, the one that differed from multiple previous versions where he denied knowing about the murder in advance. At the time, a confession was inadmissible as evidence if it was obtained, quote, by threats or promises, unquote, that were made by, quote, officials, unquote. And I apologize for all the quote, unquote, but the specific language is extremely important. Cops and prosecutors created huge loopholes in the intent of the law through the word officials. Law enforcement believed that this word meant that while police officers and prosecutors couldn't get a confession through threats or promises, private citizens could, even if they were acting under the direct instruction of the police.
So, after Charles Heyman, the Star livery stable owner, identifies Berner and Palmer, Cincinnati police use Heyman to grind Berner down. Heyman loosely knows Berner, and under very specific instructions, he goes into Berner's cell and he pretends to be his friend and his advisor. Using language that he gets from detectives, he tells Berner that if he turns state's evidence, he can go free in exchange for testifying against Palmer. But, he says, that can only happen if he confesses completely, comes entirely clean, and admits that he, quote, helped kill Kirk, unquote. He is specifically told by a man who is pretending to be his friend and pretending to know the law and tell the truth that he can walk out of jail a free man if he will confess. But he has to confess to being an active, willful participant in the act of murdering Kirk to get this deal. Now, he's also told that a lynch mob is forming outside. The police aren't going to let them in, but if the crowd gets big enough and frustrated enough that Berner hasn't confessed, there might be too many of them for the police to stop them from breaking in and lynching him. Now, of course, there is no actual lynch mob outside, and the logic doesn't quite make sense that he'll put himself on the good side of a mob by confessing his guilt. Nevertheless, he's being lied to in multiple ways, being told that he can walk out of jail a completely free man if he confesses to capital murder, but that if he fails to confess, including the specific details that the police want, he will probably be drugged from the jail and lynched.
A couple of times in this series, we've made references to the press being given free rein of the jail. In the last episode, we explained that reporters gathering around Alan Ingalls' cell and peppering him with questions triggered him to start talking, then trip himself up and confess. We also talked about how a reporter got a confession from a rapist in Newport. Police and reporters at this time had a very symbiotic relationship. Because reporters weren't quote-unquote officials, they could say whatever they wanted to elicit confessions. and some of them were very aggressive about it. In a recent incident, a reporter put a noose around a man's neck in his cell, and he threatened that he would be immediately executed unless he confessed. The man broke down and he gave a full confession. But he was released when police realized that the confession was so wildly inconsistent with the facts that the man was entirely innocent. One Cincinnati reporter named Ed Anthony was, depending on your perspective, either renowned or notorious for his ability to get confessions. And he was also given free access to Berner in between Heyman's time with him and repeated police interrogations. Ed Anthony grilled him at 10 p.m., 11 p.m., and 12:15 a.m., with Heyman and police in between. Anthony showed Berner his press credentials and told him that it gave him special status to cut a deal for him. And at 4 a.m., Anthony returned to tell him about the increasing size of the lynch mob outside, and to tell him that Palmer had implicated him, but that it wasn't too late. He could still save himself and get off by being a witness against Palmer if he would give a full confession. Now, this is all occurring a very long time before Miranda v. Arizona, the 1966 case that established a requirement to tell suspects that they have a right to an attorney and they have a right to remain silent. Berner, who was 17 years old, didn't have access to a lawyer, his parents, or any true friend.
In addition to Heyman and Ed Anthony making Berner false promises and threatening him with non-existent lynch mobs, at least one of the police officers made a promise to release him. Early in the interrogation process, after Heyman had promised to get Berner released and they took him to his house to search his room, Berner was confused. As Lieutenant Ostig was leading him back to jail, he asked him where they were going because he thought he was going to be released. Berner told the lieutenant that he wanted to go home, and Lieutenant Ostig said he wouldn't go home yet because he hadn't told the whole truth, saying, quote, "The quicker you tell the truth, the sooner you'll get out of this place," unquote, telling him that Police Chief Riley wouldn't keep him locked up for telling the truth.
On the stand, Lieutenant Osting lied about this. He denied making any form of promise to Berner at all. But T.C. Campbell had access to Osting's own notes from the interrogations, and he caught him committing perjury. He also got Heyman to admit that he repeatedly returned to Police Chief Riley to get explicit instructions on what to offer and threaten Berner with. And he got Ed Anthony to admit his role too.
But this is where we get back to the media wars. The Cincinnati Enquirer was definitely not an apologist for William Berner, and one of their own reporters routinely coerced confessions and thought that was okay. But the only reason we have the details of the interrogations is because they were reported in the Cincinnati Enquirer. Because the paper had an amicable relationship with T.C. Campbell, it reported on the coerced confession testimony in detail. It didn't report on this part of the trial with an enlightened attitude towards false confessions, but it provided enough details that Enquirer readers had a much, much more complete understanding of what Berner said, when, and what preceded it than they got from the newspapers that were personally hostile to T.C. Campbell.
Reading the Enquirer didn't make you a believer in false confessions, something that a lot of the public still struggles to comprehend today. But it meant that you had enough facts to understand that Berner was relentlessly hounded by a combination of people who made false promises, threatened him, tricked him, and deprived him of food, water, and sleep from Friday afternoon until 4:30 a.m. Saturday morning. That's when his confession got much more damning. Still not satisfied, officers continued to grill him until they got a written confession that contained both complicity in the murder and premeditation at around 7 a.m. The written confession was actually written out by Lieutenant Devine, who testified that it was, quote, in Berner's own language, with the exception of a few words, unquote.
According to the Innocence Project, on average, people who falsely confess are interrogated for up to 16 hours before they break and confess to something that they did not do.
Berner came into the police station escorted by a cop who was talking to him along the way late Friday afternoon. He was treated lightly at first, but he was questioned just after he got there. Then, after Charles Heyman arrived, how the police treated him changed radically. By around 6 p.m., they were walking him to Star Livery Stable and then his bedroom to look for evidence, grilling him along the way. And this didn't stop until around 7 a.m. the next morning. Depending on how you count it, that's somewhere between 12 to 15 hours of constant interrogation.
Now, this may not have been 12 to 15 hours of straight interrogation by the police, and the prosecution argued that he wasn't being interrogated or threatened if Charles Heyman or reporter Ed Anthony were barraging him. But I think that makes it worse. They were acting on behalf of the police, under specific instructions, and it was a form of psychological manipulation, kind of the old good cop, bad cop routine. They were the people who repeatedly threatened Berner with a lynch mob and told him he could walk free if he told them what they wanted.
Today, we know that threatening a suspect with harsher punishment if he confesses is a common, major element in false confessions. And they didn't tell him that he was facing a difference in years served on his sentence. They were telling him that if he didn't give them exactly what they wanted, he was probably going to be lynched that night. And if he did confess to participating in premeditated murder and agreed to testify against Palmer, they were going to release him. That's a huge difference between murdered on the spot or you go home to your mom.
When he gave what he thought was his final confession, he brought his hat and coat with him, which shows how clearly and literally he thought that if he said the words the police wanted to hear, he was going to get to walk out the front door and go home to his own bed. Which brings up another common element of false confessions. In the 12-plus hours he was interrogated, he was denied food, denied water, and denied sleep. He said that anytime he started to doze off in the cell, cops would poke him with either a cane or even a gun.
And he was young, which is another common element. For some reason, he told police that he was 18. Maybe he actually thought he was. They didn't celebrate birthdays exactly the same way. Or maybe he was trying to sound like he was a little bit older, a little bit tougher. But his birthday was May 4, 1866. Which means he was still 17 at the time of both the murder and his trial. Now, Judge Matthews had a lot of trouble believing in the concept of false confessions. He said that he didn't believe that a young man who was, quote, old enough to court young ladies and take them to balls, unquote, could be coerced into confessing to a crime that he didn't commit. Nevertheless, Judge Matthews reached a compromise on what evidence could be submitted to the jury. Berner's written confession was admitted, but the jury was also permitted to hear all the testimony we just described about how Berner was coerced into parts of his confession.
Now, to be clear, we are not suggesting that Berner was completely innocent. This isn't the type of coerced confession that you hear about in podcasts about modern true crime. The scenario where the person who confesses was actually on the other side of town at the time of the murder and didn't have anything to do with it. At a minimum, Berner was guilty of hiding evidence, of disposing of the body, splitting the money, and acting like a total POS afterwards. But the difference between his earlier confessions and his 7 a.m. written confession was arguably the difference between first and second-degree murder, which is the difference between hanging and life in prison.
Berner is the first witness called in his defense. He builds credibility by admitting to some ugly things. He says that he had heard Palmer talk about killing Kirk for the money he flashed on multiple occasions, and he didn't do anything to stop him. But he says that that's because he didn't take him seriously. Palmer brought it up periodically, and he thought it was just some macho bullshit. He wasn't really going to do it. He also repeated the earlier versions of his own confession, saying that he was both shocked and terrified when Palmer slammed a ball-peen hammer into the back of Kirk's head. And he had started to run, but Palmer scared him and he stuck around out of fear. Although he did admit that he agreed to take $100 to help dump Kirk's body, and he actively participated in everything that followed. Berner also testified to the events surrounding his confession. He told the jury how he was hounded all through the evening and night, denied water, food, or sleep, threatened with lynching, and promised to be released if he confessed to participating in premeditated murder. He said that he only agreed to the written confession that was submitted to the jury because he was exhausted and scared. Then, most of the rest of the defense focused on the coercion that preceded the confession.
19th century closing arguments are hard to imagine with 21st century attention spans. Both the defense and the prosecution were composed of multiple lawyers, and every one of them was given hours to deliver a closing argument. The prosecution's closing was pretty straightforward. He did it, he confessed to it, it's first-degree murder. The defense arguments were more complicated and more nuanced. First, the defense attorneys each took a different role in going through the evidence, explaining the different degrees of homicide, the elements, and what they had to conclude to convict.
And T.C. Campbell is the last defense attorney to close. He starts by pointing out the reasons that a jury might show mercy on this defendant. A jury might not convict him of first-degree murder, resulting in hanging him, because he is so young, because he is so remorseful, or simply to show mercy for his family who are weeping in the courtroom. But he says that this jury should not do that, shouldn't consider any of that. He wants them to ignore all of those things and render a verdict based on the facts.
Which is brilliant, because he lays out a purely emotional argument, but nobody can object to it because he tells them to ignore all those factors, even though you can't just remove them from your mind after they've been pointed out. Then he goes through the known history of false confessions. We know a lot more about false confessions today, why they happen, how often they happen, than anyone knew in the 1880s, but there were already multiple famous cases, including one where a convicted murderer was being led to the gallows when the man who he was supposed to have killed came riding back into town. Campbell talked about these cases and drew parallels, arguing that almost anybody would have confessed to almost anything under those horrible circumstances that produced Berner's confession to first-degree murder.
And the defense was not arguing that he was innocent, and they did not ask for an acquittal. Campbell said the defense admitted to all the testimony presented in the trial, with one exception. The written confession was unreliable and untrue because it was coerced. and the only piece of evidence that proved that Berner had participated in planning a murder and striking Kirk dead was the false confession. Therefore, they should convict him, but only for a crime less than capital murder.
Although Campbell offered to plead Berner guilty to second-degree murder before the trial, one of the other defense attorneys had listed the elements of first-degree murder, second-degree murder, and manslaughter, and he'd asked the jury to convict on manslaughter. Judge Matthews then begrudgingly instructed the jury that they were permitted to weigh the credibility of the confession within the context that produced it. And then they were sent to deliberate.
Just 90 minutes into deliberations, the jury sends out a note asking if they can convict on first-degree murder, but ask that the defendant's life be spared. The answer to that question is no. If convicted, Ohio law requires hanging him.
Now that immediately led to speculation that the jury was going to reach a compromised verdict. The trial lasted for 12 days, which was long for that era. And the jury had been sequestered. Now today, that would mean they'd stay at a Holiday Inn. Back then, it meant they were forced to sleep on cots in the jury room. The only entertainment they had was a nightly Bible reading by the deputy sheriff, so they played cards and read light popular novels to amuse themselves. In lulls in the trial, reporters wandered into the jury room to look at poker chips and reading material and used these things to criticize the jurors, speculating they were gambling or cheating at cards or that they were dumb because of the books they read. It was an incredibly unfair way to treat jurors, but it teed up reasons to blame them for an unpopular verdict.
And finally, on March 24, 1884, the jury returns its verdict. With the courtroom packed beyond capacity, the foreman passes the verdict to the clerk, who reads it into the room. We, the jury, in the issue joined, find the defendant, William Berner, not guilty of murder in the first degree, but guilty of manslaughter.
The room erupts in hissing, and people pushing for the exit. After a verdict is read, either side can ask for a jury to be polled, meaning that they are asked to individually confirm whether they agree with the verdict. When Judge Matthews asked the defense if they wanted the jury polled, they declined because they were happy. When the judge asked Prosecutor Pugh if he wanted them polled, he replied, quote, "I do not want such a jury as this to be polled."
Then Judge Matthews also broke with all decorum, and he curtly, rudely dismisses the jury without thanking them for their service. He then mutters under his breath, quote, "It is a damn outrage." He says this to himself, but he says it loud enough for reporters to hear him, maybe intentionally. This quote is then printed in newspapers across the country, removing all doubt from the public's mind that this verdict was a travesty.
Berner is cuffed and quickly led out of the courtroom through the judge's chambers. But the jurors, well, they're left to fend for themselves. They have to walk down to the treasurer's office to exchange their jury vouchers for their small payment for their service. They go as a group for protection, but the crowd around them grows increasingly abusive. People start shouting, "Hang the bastards, hang them!" On the streets, they are literally forced to run for their lives.
In a prior episode, I said I respected how William Howard Taft showed class and restraint when T.C. Campbell got the better of him in a trial. But I definitely cannot say the same thing about Prosecutor Pugh. He did everything he could to exacerbate public outrage. He didn't accept any blame for refusing the offer of a second-degree plea deal, and he did a lot of things that were unethical and deserve the reproach of history, blame that he has never previously received. Pugh gave the press an anonymous letter that came to his office that made extremely vague and entirely baseless allegations against 3 of the jurors, implying that they had been bribed by the wealthy Berner family, who, for one thing, weren't actually wealthy. Both the Inquirer and the Commercial Gazette published this complete nonsense anonymous letter in full. The Inquirer wrote that there had never been a criminal verdict that, quote, caused as much open and unfavorable comments, unquote, as this, that it stirred the pot more by claiming that juror Samuel Merrill was illiterate. The Commercial Gazette then kicked everything up a big notch by writing that there was more than one influence at work on the jury, claiming that some were influenced in ways that, quote, must be only hinted at, unquote. They were implying that the jury had been bribed, but they could only hint at it because it was a completely, utterly, 100% baseless claim.
For their part, when they weren't running for their lives, jurors were willing to explain their verdict. A juror said that none of the 12 ever believed that the prosecution had proven first-degree murder. On the first ballot, either 5 or 6 of them voted to acquit, even though the defense didn't even ask for that. They agreed that parts of the confession that included Berner participating in premeditated murder were coerced and unreliable, so they didn't consider the confession valid evidence. The last 9 ballots they took were only necessary because one juror held out for second degree rather than manslaughter.
This isn't to say that their verdict was right. We have no idea. But regardless of whether it was right or not, there was no evidence of conspiracy or bribery. Jurors could, and they did, explain how they reached their decision based on the evidence that was presented to them in court, doing exactly what they were supposed to do. The problem was that the public was largely denied the same evidence that the jury had heard. And Prosecutor Pugh bitterly lashed out in ways that validate the insinuations that Campbell fixed the jury. He tells the press that the verdict is an outrage. When a reporter asks what the implications of the verdict will be, he says, quote, the consequences will be either that murderers will have free license in Cincinnati hereafter, or there will be a revolution in popular sentiment and all murderers will hang, unquote. He says that Berner's case was the strongest criminal case pending in Hamilton County, presumably including Ingalls and Johnson, who murdered a whole family. He says that he doesn't see any reason to even bother prosecuting anybody else who can afford a defense attorney, and that all future homicides in Cincinnati will likely go unpunished. These quotes are then printed in papers from New York to Nashville. Americans are told that murder has effectively been legalized in Cincinnati, and they're able to cite both the Hamilton County prosecutor and a common pleas court judge as the proof of that.
And there was no meaningful counterpoint. There were logical voices, but they were drowned out, largely because feeding outrage and scaring the public sold newspapers. But the only people who were really justified in fearing for their lives were the Berner jurors. Juror Charles Dallahan was a printer from Harrison, Ohio. That's up near the Indiana border. He had the misfortune of traveling home on the same train that carried newspaper editions announcing the verdict. On a stop on the way, he was pelted with eggs threatened, and had to run away and sleep in a field. The next day, he was driven to town. When he tried to hide out in a town in Indiana, he was forced to flee there too.
And juror Henry Berner was in the most peril because he lived in Over the Rhine, just a couple of blocks from the courthouse. He came home to a lynch mob. Cops walking the beat took him into protective custody, and he had to spend the night in jail for his own safety. The next day, a lynch mob surrounded his house again. Police ran them off, but he was later lured out of his house by false friends who took him to be jumped and mercilessly beaten. He somehow got away and ran to the Bremen Street police station, where he had to spend another night for his own safety.
The press didn't do anything to help. When police began pelting A. Phillips's house with rotten vegetables and a dead cat, the Inquirer let them know that they had the wrong A. Phillips, leading them to the correct address of the man with the same name who was the actual juror. Now today, we would say that the Inquirer doxed the jurors, listing every one of them by name, their place of employment, which cost at least one of them his job. Phillips, the juror, went to stay with family in St. Louis. The St. Louis Chronicle found out where he was, and the Chronicle, Cincinnati Inquirer, and Cincinnati Evening Post all printed the exact address. But Phillips didn't run. He told reporters that he had pre-planned business in St. Louis. He also told them that, quote, the jury went out convinced that the confessions were extorted from Berner by threats and promises, and that the prosecution had not made out a case of murder in the first degree, unquote. Phillips spoke about deliberations candidly, and he told reporters that Prosecutor Pugh almost lost the case entirely.
After juror Harmeyer was belligerently fired from his job, he had a complete emotional breakdown and became bedridden in his home.
The jury foreman, A.F. Shaw, was a member of the Grand Army of the Republic. It's a fraternal organization made up mostly of Republican Union Army veterans. As a military-based organization, they court-martialed him in absentia, expelled him from the organization, and told a reporter that if he ever tried to attend another meeting, his former friends would break his neck.
One of the most striking things about newspaper coverage was how self-fulfilling it became. Louisville's Courier-Journal wrote that, quote, the verdict is universally condemned, unquote. Now that was true, but it was true because newspapers downplayed or ignored explanations from jurors or defense counsel and played up histrionics and unfounded rumors. After the Commercial Gazette introduced the idea that jurors had been bribed, it subsequently wrote that the, quote, imputation of unworthy motives upon the juryman is universal, unquote. So it suggested to its readers that jurors had been bribed. And then it used the belief of its readers that jurors had been bribed to validate their own baseless speculation. The paper also ratcheted up the fear-mongering, inaccurately claiming that it was almost impossible to convict criminals in Cincinnati now, and predicting that, quote, soon there will be no legal or social or moral distinction between murderers and other citizens, unquote. Where was all this nonsense heading? The New York Times was willing to help Cincinnatians and all the rest of America figure it out. The New York Times wrote, quote, it is predicted that murders, which have been unusually common for a number of weeks, will increase in number and the city of Cincinnati become terrorized unless the people take the law into their own hands. Unquote. In the last episode, we ended by telling you that there was a good reason why we went through all these stories about lynch mobs. There was, and there is. And in the next episode, we are going to tell you about what could have been the largest lynch mob in American history. That's it for now. Special thanks to Grab Bag Collab Network for their help on this podcast. And please check out grabbagcollab.com for more podcasts that we think you're really going to love. An additional thanks to our producer and director, Dan Fennessy. We will see you guys next episode.
See you next time.